But to me, it's not either or, because humans are complex. We come in different shapes and experiences. So some people have tried to define coaching by, well, clinical psychology is for people with a diagnosable disorder, and we're trying to treat a condition. And then coaching is not that, and it's for people who don't have a clinical level condition. My former and late colleague, Professor Tony Grant at the University of Sydney, would take that type of definition, which I understand from a legislative point of view, it's neat and tidy. However, from a human behaviour point of view, I think I'd rather construe coaching as a type of relationship, which is a different type of relationship than a counselling relationship or a teaching relationship. So we can talk about teacher-student. That's a type of relationship. So I would view coaching as a type of relationship which is collaborative and growth-based. Counsellors will say, well, yeah, their relationship's that too. But to me, there are sort of these different grades of what's the emphasis of.
You're well. Now, I'm excited about a talk today. It's with a colleague of mine, Lindsay Oades, who is a professor of Wellbeing Science at the University of Melbourne. He's done some incredible work in the field. I wanted to share my interview with him with you, and I hope that it's something that you could pick something from. One of the things that he said that I think was very instructive, it's given the secular age that we live in, that it seemed like a lot of coaches are replacing priests. So it's like kind of a new phenomenon. When you think about it, the role of coaches, whether it's to guide or provide some kind of direction, it's actually, if it was around the time that there was secularism has not taken place in societies, around the time where religious institutions were normalized and were the norm or was the symbol of authority, priests were playing those roles. But it's interesting how things are changing. And well-being science becomes an interesting field where you find a lot of coaches drawing from well-being science resources or information around well-being science to help people to live a flourishing life. And I think that's very instructive for us as well as we begin to think about what this looks like and what implication that this particular phenomenon might have in our time. And I hope that you enjoyed the chat and let us know what you think. All right. Talk later. See you after the interview. Bye. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Flourishing Podcast. This is Victor Candid. I'm so glad to have you here with us. On this podcast, we kind of want to help you to live a flourishing life. And so we'll share stories, ideas, scientific insights that will help you to live a flourishing life. And we'll also look at some interesting research that's been done by some colleagues. And it's all, as you know, about helping you live your best life. So thanks for listening. If you're first time joining us, I hope you're able to be part of our journey as we continue to have this healthy, important conversations. So let's get started. Now, today we have someone very important. This person is both really a pillar in the field. He's a prominent figure in the field of well-being science. I was reading that he was the one that coined the keyword well-being science. It's funny because I also started to use the same keyword myself, and at some point still refer to myself as a well-being scientist after I saw that he was also positioning himself like that. But he's a professor of well-being science at the University of Melbourne and was the founder and director, I believe, of the Centre for Wellbeing Science. And he's still also currently with the University of Melbourne and currently also the Deputy Dean of the School of Education at the University of Melbourne. I think he's a wellbeing science pioneer, and I'm really honored to have Dr. Lindsay Oades just on our podcast. Hi, Lindsay. How's it going?
Hi, Victor. Thanks for the introduction. It's nice to be referred to as important. I don't always get that at home, but it's lovely to see you again. I don't think we've caught up since we were spending good time together in Vatican City, of all places, is where I last time. So lovely to be here with you. Thank you.
I'm really honored to have you here. I know that we met in Rome. We met in Rome as we were having the working group meeting for the Humanity 2.0, I think twice now. And it's been Always wonderful just to see you. That's also the other part of that story as well. For those of you wondering how I knew Lindsay, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago or so. I connected with him. He missed out on a chance to be my boss. I just leave it there. But that's a story for another day. But ever since then, I always have high regard for him. And how he's carried himself, and really, someone that truly inspires me. I want to start with a question, around wellbeing science, which I think it's an area that you've done some incredible work in. You've sort of arguably pioneered the field of wellbeing science, at least down under Australia region, and I think your work really speaks for itself. But how would you explain the core principles of wellbeing science to someone that is, let's say, completely new to the concept? And why do you think it's important to do that?
Well, that's a great question, Victor. So the core principles of wellbeing science, I mean, you mentioned that I coined the term, which I probably didn't, but there was science of wellbeing, and that's been used for some time. I just used wellbeing science because it was shorter and easier to remember. But really, similar to science of positive psychology, how do we develop a science about what leads to, predicts, and helps grow wellbeing, and how do we actually define what wellbeing is? If we're going to have a science of something, we need to define it. Obviously, there are related concepts like human flourishing and other related concepts, but it's really that scientific method or approach, that systematic, rigorous scientific approach to understanding what is well-being and what leads to it, which is similar to some of the things that you're seeing in the science of positive psychology. But I use wellbeing science because it can be used across disciplines. So there are many approaches or many disciplines that are trying to understand the well-being, and most people, I haven't met anyone that doesn't value well-being in their own life. They may not choose to promote it directly, but most people value it. So that's probably a broad answer, but one of the questions I get is, how is positive psychology different to wellbeing science? And my simple answer would be, wellbeing is a transdisciplinary, the study of wellbeing is a transdisciplinary area, which picks up many disciplines, and the economists the philosophers have been at it for a long time, but then the economists came in, psychologists have come lately, but there are many disciplines, and of course, religious approaches as well have been having a look at this for as long as we can remember. Yeah, so it's that transdisciplinary approach, and that's really interesting because you're picking up things like law, architecture. They all have an interest and sometimes have something to say about the area. But I think the science part is an important addition because it speaks to the rigorous investigation of the approach as well.
So the science part, it's more like when you start to consider the social sciences approach to well-being itself, given the fact that other disciplines like philosophy, theology have kind of have been studying it. So it's worth distinguishing it as sort of a scientific field. Do you think that distinction also have come with some kind of pushback for the field in itself overall? How people, because for some people, when you say well-being, even in the field of psychology, it's like seen as this soft science, like, as philosophy or what have you. Do you think that's also more reason why that emphasis on science, it's important?
Yeah, I do think that. There's a couple of points there. One of the issues, if you track the history of the development of social sciences, and including some of the aspects of that with French traditions, the social sciences were actually formed to improve well-being. So yet I find it ironic that some people think that it's this unusual thing. But to come to your other part of your question, I think the science is a method, it's a set of approaches, it's many things, but some people actually look at wellbeing and science and look at those two words put together and they struggle with that because they inherently see science as subjective and they think, you can't have the science of the subjective.
Right.
Yet, ironically, at the heart of science, or half of science, is empirical experience, which is actually that. It's an experience. It's data. We can study objectively in the sense of impartial. So we can get into philosophy of science discussions, which we probably don't need to right now. But the use of science as a method, as a legitimizing and a process is important. However, there are many people who will critique that, and they do, and they'll critique scientism as only one way of knowing.
Mm.
But I personally and professionally, I actually enjoy those discussions. The discussion between theologians, philosophers, scientists, people who critique science.
Right.
We still have something that we value in the human condition, whether we call it well-being, flourishing. There's something that we're searching for.
Right.
And to me, this is a forum for those types of discussions, not only for individuals, but for organizations, societies, communities. That's why well-being sometimes gets called a thick concept by the philosophers. It's something we value, and it's something we study both at the same time. And to that heart of that debate about is science value free? So yeah. So sorry, I'll stop there. I can keep going on this, but I think we need to stop.
It's always an interesting topic to kind of dabble with, especially when you start to think about what is science and what is not, But I know there must be a personal angle to this, because even for any psychologist, particularly someone that's looking at psychology from a positive psychological angle, is there like a personal story? What led to you wanting to study well-being and eventually well-being science? Was there like a moment that you decided to pivot towards that direction? When you finished your PhD, was that the focus of your PhD? Or was there a timing point in your career that you thought it made sense to kind of go in this direction?
That's a very good question. I'd probably say there were moments of pivot, probably not a single one. My background, I came through, so raised in Australia. I had a very secular upbringing. But my father was an applied chemist, science of soil, agriculture. So he was effectively a chemist, and that type of scientific and analytical thinking. Mum was, I was one of four, so mum had home duties and very loving, caring, you may say traditional mother if you like, but very emotional, empathic person. So I was always influenced by, on the one hand, I had this kind of scientific worldview father and an emotional empathic mother. So I had the kind of, it's not quite this simple, but I had the two poles of reason and emotion, for want of a better way of framing it. But I did studies in clinical psychology, and so I did my PhD in clinical. I did my PhD in clinical psychology, which included the professional training to be a clinical psychologist. So that was my intellectual, formal training, if you like. And but underneath that, there was quite a bit of philosophy in my undergrad. So that was the beginning. But what happened was I kind of came a little disenchanted with the negative focus of the clinical approach, which was really trying to base itself on a medical paradigm and still does, has some advantages, and we need that scientific approach. But I was attracted to approaches which more emphasized human growth, the positive end of the spectrum, agency, and systems, which is why I was drawn to some aspects of the mental health recovery movement, because that was about the patient or the consumer or the person with lived experience and their view of their life and how it could have meaning and growth. And as that developed, I became aware and attracted to approaches like coaching psychology, even though at the time it was being shunned, and there are many people, there are many things that practitioners may do or claim that aren't good, but that doesn't make the fundamental essence of the idea not good, which is a bit like the claim don't judge the Bible by what Christians do. It's the same sort of idea. Don't judge the area by what practitioners do that may not be optimal. But not just practitioners, by the way, but people. So it developed. So I became interested in coaching. I became interested in positive psychology, and it's that adage: you learn what you believe when you hear yourself say it, or you learn what you value when you see yourself do it. So it kind of evolved, and then wellbeing became a broad term that captures many of these things, because I've done stuff which relates to wellbeing in health services, stuff which relates to wellbeing in organisations. Now we're doing stuff which relates to wellbeing in education systems. So to me, they're all just different contexts, but the fundamental endeavour around wellbeing, flourishing, and the scientific approach to it, and how we do that better, is kind of what pulls it all together for me. So in terms of pivots, there was a pivot away from directly clinical psychology and the reparative aspect of that. However, I still very much value what clinical psychologists do. It just wasn't for me the place where I thought I would make the best contribution. And then the other pivot more recently, the Centre for Positive Psychology, as it used to be called here at the University of Melbourne, I changed the name of that to the Centre for Wellbeing Science, really to incorporate more broadly the approaches to wellbeing, not only from a psychological perspective. So that was a bit of a pivot. But more personally, underpinning all that, I think I've seen people's approaches to mental health and mental illness, and that, and particularly for adolescents, I've seen that done well. I've seen it done really poorly, and I feel that that's probably why I've become really interested in the younger end of the spectrum, because I think that area is teachable and learnable, and which is what's led to what I would call a more educational approach to this area than a clinical health. And it's not that we should stop a clinical or health approach. I just think the educational approach is an underutilized way of thinking about the well-being of a population. Yeah. So I don't know if there's enough there. I keep asking me, but there's a lot. It was a big question.
Yeah. And I see the educational approach that you're taking, which is something that we'll talk about in a second. But it's interesting because you mentioned well-being and flourishing. Of course, as you know, there's some kind of debate or current conversation around that. I know also we kind of touched a bit on that while we were at the Vatican, not as in-depth as we would have wanted. But is there like a difference, whether it's conceptual or epistemological difference between well-being as a construct, flourishing as a construct, and even thriving, which is also another construct that you also work with? Is there like some kind of difference between these three? For someone listening to this podcast and perhaps have heard these three words, almost anyone knows what, have heard about thriving and flourishing and well-being. Are there things do they mean the same thing? Can they be used interchangeably? At what point it's something thriving and then it's no longer thriving? Do you have any stake in this debate?
I have a lot of stake in this debate. I guess starting at the beginning, people do use them interchangeably, and people in the general public will use them interchangeably. And I use the analogy of an entomologist who studies bugs. To most people, they're all bugs or insects. And it's the same thing if you just call something happiness in a broad term in the way we use it every day. That's like, to a wellbeing scientist, that's like calling everything a bug, even though there are lots of differences. Let's talk about maybe happiness, wellbeing, flourishing, and thriving. We'll just stay with those four. Obviously, happiness is a popular term, but within both philosophy and particularly positive psychology or
and even popular culture.
Yeah. Popular culture, yeah. So people will use, there's the philosophical debate, and I know you know this, Victor, but for the listeners, the philosophical debate between hedonism and eudaimonism. So a pleasurable life or having more pleasure than pain, that kind of hedonic view, and then the eudaimonic view from the different Roman and Greek philosophers. A life well lived, being close to true self and living an ethical life, which is the more eudaimonic view. And there are many, and the philosophers say that's a fundamental distinction, which is useful for philosophers because that's their job. Empirically, we're finding that it's not quite that simple. And in most of our lived experience, we do want a little bit of pleasure in our life, and it's only the aesthetics in certain people or certain religions which will emphasize that we don't have or we don't seek pleasure. So that's a fundamental distinction, which, whether people have heard of those terms or not, is as important. If you actually look and listen to people, they are actually wrestling with those things every day. Should I have pleasure tonight? Should I go out and have fun and enjoy myself, or should I be purposeful and live a more broader, higher order way? They sound abstract to start with, but they're in our lives every day. So to come back to your original question, these are what I call well-being. Let's start with well-being. It's what I call it's both a contested and a capacious concept. And what I mean by capacious is you can stuff a lot into that term. It fits a lot of things in it. But people argue about what it is. So I I'm actually enamored by the concept of flourishing, and to me that's the high order one. That's the big one, because it's in the work, not only from the work of Aristotle and the Stoics, for example, with the eudaimonic approach. We recently did work with UNESCO on an education project, International Science and Evidence-Based Assessment of Education, where we were, the group I was involved with, were charged with the question of what is flourishing and what is education and how the two related. But we similar to drawing from some of the work, obviously, of the philosophers, but also the ancient philosophers, or at least the Greek philosophers, working with education philosophers. In summary, we were kind of viewing flourishing as a process, which is probably the important part. When defining these things, is it an event, or is it a long-term process? And a lot of people aren't good at conceptualizing a process. They're used to things being nouns and being single objects. So if flourishing is a process of realizing one's potential, which includes ethical potential, but through living both humanistic and other values, and there, that was where the debate really came in: is whose values, whose ethics, and that's where you get into the ethical debates and who decides. But at a practical level, also it was experiencing well-being while we're doing it. So in a school, that could become: am I realizing my potential, and am I experiencing well-being while I'm doing it? And also, what role does the environment have in that? So that kind of has flourishing in it as a process of realizing one's potential. And as I said, well-being can be viewed straight as happiness or not. And then there's this other term, thriving, which is the one I'm particularly interested in. And to me, they are different. Thriving, I'm influenced by the one of the original etymological derivations of the word, meaning from thrifa, which means to take hold of the environment. Commonly we hear terms, particularly in medical and early developmental contexts, where we hear terms like failure to thrive, which often means failure to reach developmental milestones. But also that's actually consistent with thrifa, because it's basically saying that the infant or the organism hasn't taken hold of the environment. It's not growing because it's not interacting with the environment, and internally and externally as well. Because we have internal environments, which we can think of our own psychology as an internal environment, and our physiology, etc. But thrifa is interesting because what it does for me is thriving as taking hold of the environment. It puts person and environment in interaction all the time, which of course it is. And we're all interacting with our environment all the time. But some of the more individualistic approaches, including psychology, has been accused of this, we'll focus on the individual, and if we do that too much, we may end up separating them from the environment, which is all right as a discipline, as an assumption. But I'm interested in thriving because it's about how are we taking hold of our environment? Are we experiencing well-being while we're taking hold of the environment? And does the way we relate to our environment enable us to realize our potential? Which takes us to a lot of the big questions, big questions for society. Is your destiny predetermined? Are you realizing your potential? Is it destiny, or am I free to chart my course? How does my social role, how does the economy impact on whether I'm realizing my potential? Who even decides what my potential is? And so they're big. You can see straight away how big those questions are. So that's why I like thriving, because it gets away from it. Well, it's more than, am I experiencing more pleasure than pain, which is this sort of hedonic happiness view. It actually adds something in terms of the interaction with environment, but still keeps the notion of human flourishing as a broader frame.
So this is very insightful, and I'm really grateful that you went in depth to kind of unpack this. But at what point, given the fact that you've argued that flourishing is more of a process, of course, it's a set of it's an act of doing something, an act of becoming something, right?
Yeah.
At what point then would your thriving translate to flourishing? And at what point does that happen? Or does it have to first, how does it then, does it have to influence your well-being before it becomes flourishing? Like, what is that? How do we is there like a developmental process to this that can help us to mark, well, it sounds like it starts with thriving, because it involves an interaction with your environment and what is going on in your world, in your context. Also, it kind of goes back to my work on place as well. And at what point does that interaction, right, leads to then well-being, which I don't know if there's the sequential order, which then leads to flourishing. How are you kind of conceptualizing that process?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's one I haven't been asked. I haven't heard it asked in that way before in terms of a developmental process or sequence. First, what I'd say, to frame my answer, everything I just outlined is probably at the heart of the work I've been trying to develop on what I'm calling thrivability theory, which actually is based on exactly what I just said, a distinction between happiness, flourishing, thriving, and well-being, and seeing them all as slightly different parts of what is a complex puzzle. But to answer your direct question, I probably don't think of it as a sequence as such. I probably think of concepts embedded within each other. So flourishing is the broader, most inclusive, high-order one. And one way of thinking about this too is what gets construed as more objective, that is viewable from the external part, and what's construed as more subjective, which is what some of the philosophers will argue about whether well-being, they view flourishing as a more objective concept because it's based on ethics, and there are some given assumptions, whereas aspects of well-being have been viewed as more subjective, or there's the discussion about hybrid, they've got a bit of both in them. To me, thriving could be viewed objectively. That is, are you interacting and taking hold of your environment? And if well-being's more subjective, then it's what's your experience while you're interacting with the environment. But then more broadly, at a high order, are we realizing, or are we deemed to be realizing our potentials? So there's that. Ultimately, that's a philosophical debate. So what I guess to my answer directly to your question is no, it's probably not sequential, but you could think of them as
like a dynamic interaction.
Yeah, and flourishing's the one which is probably the most high order, and not surprisingly, that's the philosophers were wrestling with it. But things like if we think about developmental let's take a human child being born and then going through their actual physical and psychological developmental stages, or some people don't like stages, but that process, human flourishing and things like that are pretty high order. So you're probably going to start with more simple things like pleasure, pain, joy, the development of emotions. And so it's developmental in as much as when we say as a child realizing their potential, at the beginning, we're probably thinking about more physical things. And then as they develop, we'll be thinking about ethics, character development, things like that. So it's developmental in that sense, but conceptually, if we talk about humans in general, I wouldn't say it was developmental. I would see them as complementary parts of a broader approach to each of these four concepts. I can talk more about thrivability theory later because I take a particular take on.
Yeah, because I also see that it kind of becomes the way to which you kind of talk about coaching interventions as well.
Yeah.
And where you talked about internal factors and external factors, the interaction between these two. And that external factor could be that environment, different things like access to resources, people's having opportunities to grow and all that, and how the interaction that the person have. The internal factors will probably be the character strengths. So how does those things lead to some kind of coaching intervention? Could you maybe we segue this to like your flourishing for coaching or the well-being coaching? Is that what informed the need to come up with the well-being coaching framework as a way of actually helping people to thrive, to manage that interaction with the environment? Is that what you're getting at with that?
It wasn't probably what informed the need for it. I think the issues I was just talking about are probably broader than coaching. But for me personally and professionally, where coaching came from was I was seeing at that time I was working in a lot of mental health systems, and and seeing people with different titles, but what gets construed as serious mental illness or enduring mental illness, repeat users of hospitals. So we're talking about people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And this was in an Australian context, but I also saw it in other contexts around the world, including Canadian and China, like etc. So it was pretty common. But looking at what was happening is a lot of the goal was symptom reduction, basically, and containment of people who are very much struggling and disenfranchised, etc. But I was actually looking at the essence of what was going on was containment, reduction or removal of something unwanted, be it certain behaviour or be it certain experiences like voices, diagnoses, delusions, etc. So it was really what I would call avoidance motivation, removing something that's not wanted or reducing an unwanted thing, which is a particular type of motivation for a system to have. I was interested in the complementary approach of what do people want to grow, develop, etc., which led my interest in the mental health recovery movement, because it was really a group of people saying, well, we'll define what recovery is, we'll define what the desired outcome is. And once I started looking at that and we were researching it, we were finding things like meaning, purpose, what's now called wellbeing, aspects of hope, a lot of the positive psychology constructs we were hearing in the context of mental health recovery. So coaching for me was a vehicle to have those conversations, not only with people living with illness, but practitioners in those systems. How can we have growth-based conversations where the immediate assumption isn't about symptom reduction? That's where my interest in coaching came from. And positive psychology coaching at that time was also starting to be defined as coaching for wellbeing. Started to see this synergy, and of course, as around the world, there's many different types of coaching, be it executive coaching, skills-based coaching, etc. But at the heart of them, there are different, like all things, there are jingle-jangle problem, different people calling things the same thing, and different things being called the same thing, being called different things, and different things being called the same thing, these sorts of problems. But at the heart of it, if I had to encapsulate it, you have structured conversations about helping people grow and develop, which don't assume a clinical problem at the outset. So that's where my interest in coaching came from. At the heart of it, how do we help people develop agency, even though they may be in very difficult situations? And I've seen that being done. I've been involved in that. And people might say, well, that doesn't cure schizophrenia. It was like, no, that was never the goal. That was never the claim. The claim was, how do we help people have meaningful, purposeful lives while they experience some well-being, whether they have a disability, a diagnosis, or even a terrible living condition, their environmental issues. Yeah, so long-winded answer, but that's the link, and that's where my interest in coaching came from.
It's interesting that you're saying that. I'll come back to well-being for a second, and I understand the need for the recovery movement and the importance of that. But is it a way of supporting the work that clinical psychologists or those in the mental health profession are currently doing? Because sounds like doing well-being coaching sounds like we're opening a new door for people to come into, whether get certified. I don't know if there's any well-being coaching certificate currently ongoing, but do you think it's like these are some things that therapies and mental health professionals should be doing? Why do we need to do well-being coaching? Why is it important? Because I'm thinking, okay, on one hand, we know that we don't need to pathologize mental health, which is what most clinical psychologists are trained to do. Now, with the strength-based approach, it becomes much more important to think about how can we draw from character strengths to kind of help people whether thrive, interact better with their environment and their struggles and whatever that they are dealing with. But for well-being coaching, essentially, it sounds like we are opening the net to people to come and get this knowledge or experience or mastery of this particular process to help people. At what point is something that psychologists have to do or mental health professionals have to do? and then something anyone, so far you have a passion for it, because especially with coaching, of course, a lot of criticism within the coaching movement, and how, nowadays anyone could wake up tomorrow and say they're a coach, right? Is there like a cap? Like who is a well-being coach, essentially? Who is qualified to be one? Is it a mental health professional that already is practicing, or someone that, I don't know, wakes up one morning and decides to call themselves a well-being coach because they've watched 2 hours or so of video or training on well-being, and now you understand where I'm going with that question?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's tease that apart a little, understand exactly where you're going with the question. So there's a few parts to that. There's firstly, what I'm hearing you ask is about the accreditation and the skill of the person who claims to have a set of expertise or practice. In this case, it could be a wellbeing coach or a life coach or a whatever coach. So if we just go back to what is a coach, the essence of it is derived from the term, to guide. It actually comes from, stagecoach, where you're guiding the horse. So at that level, if we think about guide, there are many people who claim to guide, counsel, whatever. And so there have certainly been attempts at who gets to call themselves a coach, and there are, International Coach Federation, for example, is one accrediting type body, if you like. And of course, any area, there's going to be pushback. So when the financial planners came in, the accounting profession got upset. The psychology profession has quite a bit to say about coaching in this accreditation type area, as they should. If you set unrealistic goals with a depressed person, you'll probably make them more depressed. So that's a simple, trite example, but so there's good reason those discussions are happening. So what I'm saying is the accreditation question is one type of question. What claims are being made about the skills of this group? What are the constraints and guardrails? And that's a really important thing. More fundamentally, though, at the heart of it, for me, comes back to, is this a growth-based conversation or is it a reparative conversation? Counselors, psychologists, pastoral care folks, they'd all probably say, I already do growth-based as well already, and many of them do. But at the heart of it, to me, is the core aim of the process to help people grow and develop, or is it more about ameliorating or solving a problem or removing something that's unwanted, be it a symptom or distress or drug and alcohol addiction? But to me, it's not either or, because humans are complex. We come in different shapes and experiences. So some people have tried to define coaching by, clinical psychology is for people with a diagnosable disorder, and we're trying to treat a condition, and then coaching is not that, and it's for people who don't have a clinical level condition. My former and late colleague, Professor Tony Grant at the University of Sydney, would take that type of definition, which I understand from a legislative point of view, it's neat and tidy. However, from a human behaviour point of view, I think I'd rather construe coaching as a type of relationship, which is a different type of relationship than a counselling relationship or a teaching relationship. So we can talk about teacher-student. That's a type of relationship. So I would view coaching as a type of relationship which is collaborative and growth-based. Counsellors will say, their relationship's that too. But to me, there are sort of these different grades of what's the emphasis of what the purpose is and the way you're relating. I'll stop there. There's a few there's lots in that, but that's a couple of comments on your question. So yes, accreditation's absolutely necessary, but I would start distinguishing between these different approaches. I mean, you can have an unskilled. I have to be careful because I'm standing in a faculty of education, but you can have an unskilled teacher. You can have an unskilled. Pick any profession you can have, or any area. Some people have greater claims to competency than others. So I support the regulatory gaze of these approaches, but I'm more interested in the actual essence of what are we doing, which actually loops back to a broader issue about the secularization of society. Historically, we've seen religion has provided systems and frameworks for people to make sense of meaning and purpose in their lives. and as we've seen secularization, people have been looking for different places to have these conversations. And one of the reasons we might have seen the rise, I want to say might have because I can't quote you empirical data for this, so I'm just speculating here, but one of the reasons we may have seen the rise of things like life coaching is that people are looking for context to have conversation, life meaning and purpose in ways which are not pathologizing, but also not attached to religion. So that's another part of this.
So in that sense, it's more like people are looking for sort of a religious figure that is not a religious figure, essentially, to help them walk through whatever recovery process of,
Yeah. There's also a business model aspect or a distribution aspect to this. So a lot of in the West, a lot of our psychotherapy kind of model almost comes from areas like confession or one-on-one person where we sit together privately and talk intimately. And a lot of our, if you actually look at a lot of our psychotherapeutic models, that's what they're based on. However, from a broad population point of view, that's a big call to be able to distribute that service to 7 billion people. Interested in how we can distribute those meaningful, helpful approaches at large to greater needs. So I don't, franchising confession is probably a strange way of thinking about it. But,
and the best way to do that is to find coaches to kind of become the new priests that would.
Yeah, but even then, if it's one-on-one, it still doesn't solve the problem. So this is why we saw in the United Kingdom, we saw Lord Richard Layard's work on the mass training of counsellors because he was worried about the productivity. He's a labour economist. The productivity losses of people being in distress. He was saying there was an economic rationale for greater distribution of these types of skill sets. So that's a slightly different issue, but it's kind of like how if we know that certain processes, certain psychological processes and interactions are helpful to people, improve their well-being or productivity or sense of meaning and purpose in life, but it isn't necessarily attached to a religious base. It could be, but isn't necessarily. How do we do it, and how do we do it at scale? That's a different question. I'm not saying coaching is the answer to that, but I'm saying coaching.
It's an alternative model, essentially, to what we currently have, that it's understaffed, essentially. There's a mental health crisis around the world, almost in any country, partly also due to COVID as well. Even before COVID, we also had spikes in mental health crisis. But it looks like the current mental health professionals are not enough. So it makes sense why, I guess, coaching comes in to complement those efforts, essentially. Of course, there will be legislative issues and accreditation issues that will come. But I guess this is still at its infancy, essentially. But I know that part of that, you've also done some work drawn from the collaborative recovery model to kind of do some of your work, which, of course, makes it a real difference in mental health recovery. Can you kind of walk us through, I know that our time is almost up, but can you walk us through, let's say, hypothetical coaching session using this particular model, and just to highlight some of the key steps and techniques? If I'm a Wellbeing coach, for example, you will let me know where to get the certification and accreditation. Let's say if I'm a Wellbeing coach, what are the steps and techniques that I could take from that collaborative recovery model, just a hypothetical coaching section, and what that would look like?
Sure. So collaborative recovery model was really just and it's quite old now. We started that work in 2004. However, there are still mental health services who use it, including East Melbourne, Eastern Mental Health Service, which is actually a large mental health service in eastern side of Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. But essentially that was everything I just spoke about before in terms of how to help practitioners working in mental health systems and also people living with the experience of a mental illness or mental health condition, how to help them work collaboratively to have collaborative growth-based conversations. So what we did is we developed frameworks. It's essentially a six-component model, practice model. One was about recovery as an individual process. That is, that people's experiences and journeys are different, and that needs to be honoured from the outset. So they may have the same diagnosis, but they will have a very different life experience. which might sound obvious and sort of rudimentary, but a lot of systems don't actually deal with that particularly well in terms of the individual meaning and purpose experiences, because they're based on objectivity of medical approach. The other part to it is collaboration and autonomy. So a lot of these systems historically were based on control and metaphors of separation. So if you track the history of psychiatry, it started with separation. We separated people from society. We put them in asylums. And I'm not saying that everything about that was bad. There are aspects of asylum which gave people exactly that. It gave them asylum and safety and protection for some and not for others. So collaboration and autonomy support was at the heart of that. So actually training mental health workers, for want of a better term, in that approach, which for some of them came very easily, and for others it was a challenge. And we've actually had unions come out against us when we were implementing this, because it were kind of medico-legal risk and these sorts of discussions. So arguments about degrees of autonomy that led to. But the rest of it was essentially what I'd call a goal-striving cycle. And it was very typical to coaching. Are you ready for change? What are your commitments to make change? What are your plans? And how do we review it? And again, that's pretty rudimentary stuff. But implementing that at scale in systems with people who have had languages which are saturated by illness and deficit, vocabularies of illness and deficit, not vocabularies of meaning, hope, purpose, different discourse. So there's a real workplace and organizational development aspect to it as well. So a session could be working, if it's a worker working with a person who's living with an illness. Some of it's very familiar, but it's conversations about meaning and purpose in life. And rather than symptom reduction being the assumed goal, symptoms will be a barrier, but not the only goal. And that's the essence of the growth-based approach. However, these are systems that are overstretched. People are moving around a lot. You have hospitals with acute admissions. They might have stays for 4 days, and then they go back out into the community. Who follows it up? How do you sustain a meaning and purpose of a person with them? Collaborative recovery and other approaches since are trying to do that. And interestingly, I was invited to talk in Bologna only a month or two ago, and we were talking about recovery colleges, and that is an educational approach to mental health recovery, where they actually go to college to learn life skills in general. But it's a good example of an educational rather than a treatment approach. So I'll stop there, Victor. There are many other ways of answering your question, but hopefully I'm again re-emphasizing what's the purpose of the interaction.
And I really appreciate that. And I think one of the steps, it's also the idea of identifying strengths in the individual as well, and something that, is there like an assessment tool that is usually used in those kind of sessions, or is it just based on just overall, is it a therapeutic section? Does it involve using some kind of assessment as you would do, let's say, when you're seeing a psychologist? And I'm trying to just to get the distinction here, because it sounds like...
there has been, and it depends on which agency we were working with, and they still use assessments. So of course, if you hang around a positive psychology type person, they'll talk about the VIA strengths and character strengths survey, which is fine. Many people in mental health systems may or may not have come across those approaches, but in essence, I've seen different variations of that in different services, but some level of values clarification or strengths clarification, which can vary greatly, especially if you're dealing with people who have some cognitive challenges. There are different ways those conversations can look and feel, but they might go right through to via strength surveys and then conversations about, so what, how can I use this in my life? But it's really interesting because I've literally had people come to me crying, saying, why wasn't I taught this 20 years ago? Because they've been in and out of hospital, but they'd only ever had conversations about illness, deficit, symptoms. So they have illness saturated conversations. And this is why I became interested in wellbeing literacy, is what does it actually look like, and how do we help people have conversations about wellbeing, not in replace of clinical conversations, to complement clinical conversations.
Right.
And that's kind of probably the essence that's driven some of this work.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know our time it's done almost, but if it's okay, just for just a couple of minutes, just to ask this question, because I'm sure that a lot of people listening that is interested in well-being science and even the coaching aspect of that, and thinking about how to utilize the CRM model. But how do you think that well-being coaching, for example, that it differs from traditional coaching models, and what is particularly effective, I guess, for individuals facing mental health challenges? Is it that they go the traditional well-being, traditional coaching route and model? Do they use that someone that's already into the coaching system? Or do they go with well-being coaching? Or well-being coaching, do they have to do when it has to do with the mental health or strength-based struggle that an individual might have? What is the difference between the two? And the other question would be, in society, how can we sort of promote well-being literacy in our community, what places, of course, to create a flourishing society? What would that look like? But you could, sequentially answer the questions however you feel like, yeah.
So 2 very small questions there just to finish it.
I'm sure a lot of people are listening and thinking about what to do, and how would what is the difference between the two?
With wellbeing coaching, I mean, wellbeing coaching is a catch-all kind of term, and you do see other terms like positive psychology coaching. It's hard to have any coaching session where wellbeing won't come up, because we value wellbeing, and wellbeing is part of our life. So I would answer in just fairly quickly, because I'm aware of the time. What's the purpose of the coaching is the essence of it. Some coaching will be explicitly goal-based, and sometimes explicitly about a health and wellbeing topic. So it's more about what's the purpose of the coaching. So for people, just to clarify that question before they seek out a coach, and I just finished a coaching, executive type coaching experience myself, and I had two clear purposes of what it was about. In neither case was the purpose about well-being, but in every case, well-being came up as a topic. So it's really about what the focus is, and that our forthcoming book, which is about is exactly that, about health and well-being coaching. That's a broad term, and there are many things in that. And one example where coaching is really helpful is there's some authors that have written about coaching for menopause, because there are many women who obviously experience menopause, and they have medical, they go and get medically assessed and helped as they should, but the lived experience of how to live during that period is what's resonating for them, and that's where they were interested in the concept of coaching for menopause, which is not medical, it's not claiming to be that, but it's helping people live with their lived experience through that process. So that's a kind of I'll just put that in there as an example. To come to your second question, how do we get a flourishing society? Was that the question to finish with?
Can you hear me? Apologies.
I couldn't hear you.
I was saying, how can we essentially promote well-being literacy? Given the fact from all that we've talked about, we know that it would contribute to a flourishing society. How can we strategically do that? Whether in our workplaces or communities, are there certain communities that particular topic is of importance more than the others? What do you think about that?
So wellbeing literacy, just for listeners, is an approach we've been working on. Put simply, it's how we communicate about and for wellbeing. I've tried to combine literacy learning with wellbeing science, essentially. We know quite a bit about how to improve literacy, and it's a big thing around the world, and people who have literacy have better well-being. We know that conclusively, but I was interested in it literally around the well-being vocabulary and how we communicate about well-being for ourselves, and how we communicate in a way which is well-being enhancing for others, which is, once you start looking, that's a huge topic. And of course, when I say literacy, we're not only talking about reading and writing, we're talking about speaking and listening. We're talking about creating things which other people may view. So it goes all the way from emojis on texting through to literally whether we're using good words, whether we're speaking respectfully. So it's a very broad area, but with well-being as the guiding principle. So what we are doing already is looking at curriculum in schools and pedagogy in schools. But also workplaces, their communication aspects. So to the simple answer to how do we do it If we go through the major social institutions that we have, schools, health systems, workplaces, marriages, relationships, big social institutions, enable them to have conversations or communications that could be construed as wellbeing enhancing. That's the kind of level we'll get to. Of course, we're seeing gender-based violence, we're seeing deepfake porn with AI, we're seeing horrendous examples of things. But actually, if you look at them, a lot of them are communicative issues about what's happening in the way people are communicating. Wellbeing literacy also looks at intentions. So what's the intention of communication? And of course, I know the US just had their election, and there's lots of examples of and discussions about how well people are communicating or not, things like that. So wellbeing literacy is not an abstract thing. It's something people are experiencing, living every day. But at the heart of it, to answer your question, each of our major social institutions may need to be looking at these things. In a similar way, to come back to my reference to the secular age and Charles Taylor's book, Secular Age, our social institutions used to be governed by a set of clear ethical principles, be they Christianity in the West, Islam in other areas, or Buddhism or Hinduism in parts of Asia. Less and less in certain places that's the case. So if that's the case, what other ethical principles are guiding them? And so wellbeing literacy is just ultimately that's not the answer. That's the how. But the why has got to come from the social institutions.
Wow, that's been so insightful. I want to thank you personally for making the time and just articulating some of these answers in a way that it's clear and enriching. Just before you leave, just for, let's say, someone that might be listening now and just thinking about picking up interest within the wellbeing literacy, wellbeing coaching field, and thinking about the next steps and, what can they do to become a wellbeing coach, for example, what are the next practical steps that you could ask the person to take? Or is there like a particular certification or programs that you could recommend that a person start essentially or enroll in to become a wellbeing coach? Are there like things out there that you're currently doing that you would want to recommend, especially as we wrap up?
Yeah, I think that depending on where you are in the world, in the coaching space, I'd just Google International Coach Federation, and they can tell you where legitimate coach training opportunities exist. Don't want to do it country by country because it would take too long, so I'd start with that one. In terms of wellbeing literacy, finalising, hopefully there's a wellbeing literacy book that comes out next year. When I say hopefully, it's drafted, but as to when its release date is, it's sure. But wellbeing literacy, if you just Google wellbeing literacy and or email me, I can send you some more material. That's kind of more embryonic in some ways than coaching at large, of course, but they're clearly related.
Fantastic. I want to thank you for making the time. And for those of you watching, this is a Flourishing Podcast where we talk about all things flourishing. And we're so excited just to listen and learn so much about well-being coaching, well-being literacy, and many more other things, Thrivability theory. And I'm really thankful for the time that you made, Lindsay, to kind of share all these thoughts. And I hope that you have a great day. And my regards to our people in Melbourne.
Great. Thanks so much, Victor. Lovely being with you.
Same here. Thank you.
Hey, I hope that you enjoyed that interview, the podcast interview with Lindsay. A lot of exciting stuff that's been said. And let me know what you think. And if you have any comments or question, don't hesitate to drop a comment below or even send us an email if you have to. You can personally send me an email to connect@victorcounted.org. And I'm looking forward to our next conversation. In fact, I will give a hint on that. We'll be talking about communication and how the role that plays, especially when we think about flourishing. And I'm excited about our next guest, who is a researcher at the Human Flourishing Program. Her name is Kate. But I'm looking forward to my conversations and chat with her. But hey, until then, we'll see you next time.